Some mornings out here bite harder than others. The frost comes early, creeping up the edges of the windows until the cabin feels like it's been swallowed by ice. Eleanor Whitlock moved softly in that pale light, so as not to wake the children, her fingers pulling a needle through Samuel's worn shirt by the glow of a stubborn ember in the hearth. The boards groaned under her steps like an old man's knees, but she'd learned to live with such complaints from the bones of her home. A knock came then, faint like a branch brushing the door. She opened it, and the cold rushed in, sharper than a blade. On the stoop, half slumped over his horse's neck, was a man she'd never seen. His coat was torn, the dark stain across his ribs spreading as if the cold couldn't slow it. The horse shifted, and the man tumbled into the dirt, groaning low. Eleanor knelt beside him, bare hands finding the weak pulse in his neck. Alive, but only just. She glanced at the sky, the clouds already gathering for snow, and made the choice she knew might change everything. With Samuel's help, she dragged him inside. They laid him near the hearth. The boy fetched water, his jaw tight like a man twice his age. Eleanor worked in silence, cleaning the wound, steam rising from the cloth in her hands. The stranger muttered through fever, half-names and broken words. Betrayal clung to his voice like smoke. Clara padded over, holding a blanket too big for her, and tucked it around him without a word. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and somewhere far off a coyote called. "You don't choose who fate drops at your door," the narrator in her blood whispered, "but you choose what you do about it." 2 days later, she rode into town with a basket of eggs to trade for flour. The moment she stepped into Mary Lou Granger's store, she felt the eyes. Mary Lou's thin smile carried more judgment than kindness. "Word is you've got company out there," she said as if stirring sugar into her tea. Men leaning against the post office wall glanced over, their mutters thick with tobacco and speculation. Sheriff Amos Crow caught her outside, his voice low. "You're sure about keeping him?" "It wasn't an order, just a warning." Garrett Boone, he told her, had powerful enemies. Eleanor nodded once and went on her way, the sting of gossip burning hotter than the cold. When the man woke, the first thing he saw was a little girl staring at him from the foot of the bed. His voice came rough, asking where he was, but softened when Clara smiled shyly. He tried to sit, grimacing. Eleanor appeared at his side, her tone sharp but not unkind. "Lie back. You'll tear the stitch." He muttered thanks in a way that sounded almost foreign to him. Then he offered money for her trouble. She shook her head. "I didn't do it for coin." That, more than the wound, seemed to unsettle him. In the days that followed, they moved around each other like two wary wolves learning the other's scent. Garrett showed Samuel how to mend a saddle strap. His hands practiced even with the stiffness in his side. Eleanor caught him chopping firewood one afternoon, sweat beading at his temple despite the cold. At night, while the children slept, she mended the hole in his coat. Her fingers paused over the ragged bullet hole. She wondered what kind of life left a man bleeding alone in the snow. Trouble found them sooner than she'd hoped. One afternoon, 3 riders came up the slope, Tommy Burke among them, a drifter with a mouth full of threats and a history that smelled of whiskey and cheap bets. They asked after a thieving coward named Boone. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her frame small but unmoving, blocking their view inside. Tommy's eyes swept her cabin like a thief counting coins, and he mentioned things he'd heard about her late husband's debts. She didn't flinch. They rode off eventually, but their laughter trailed behind like a burr that sticks where it's not wanted. Inside, Garrett watched from the shadows, shame etched deep in the set of his mouth. That night, the wind came howling. Rain turned to sleet, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Garrett spoke into the storm, telling her about the land he'd built, the foreman he'd trusted, the ambush that had left him for dead. She listened, her hands still over the mending in her lap. When he was done, she told him loss was something you carried until it bent your shoulders and changed your gait. It didn't leave you. It simply became the shape of you. He didn't answer, but the quiet between them felt less like distance and more like understanding. A week later, Tommy came back. This time he had a shotgun balanced across his lap and 2 men behind him. Garrett stepped out. leaning heavy on a crutch but standing tall. The air between them was cold and brittle. Tommy demanded the cattle deeds he thought Garrett carried. Garrett said no. The refusal was like striking flint. Tommy's hand twitched near the trigger. That's when Samuel appeared in the doorway, his mother's old rifle braced against his shoulder. Eleanor stepped forward, placing herself between the men. Her voice didn't rise, it cut. "You'll leave this land now." She didn't sound like she was asking. She sounded like a woman who'd buried enough and was ready, if need be, to bury more. Something in her eyes made Tommy hesitate. He spat into the dirt, muttered something low, and pulled his horse around. The three of them disappeared into the cold, their hoofbeats fading into the scrub. Garrett's eyes followed Eleanor, not with gratitude exactly, but with the weight of respect. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do for a man is let him see you'll fight for what's yours, even if what's yours is him. By the time Garrett could ride, the world had begun to thaw. He called the children outside one morning. For Samuel, he brought a fine bay mare, her coat shining in the pale light. A boy should have a horse to grow into, he said. For Clara, he offered a small wooden bird, smooth from years of turning in his hand. He didn't tell her it had kept him company through long, lonely trails. For Eleanor, there were no words, only the folded deed to a small patch of fertile land, left under the jar of flour she'd fetched that morning. She found it after he'd gone, the sound of his horse's hooves already swallowed by the wide prairie. Years later, folks still whispered about the winter the widow took in the dying cattle baron. Some swore he'd never forget her. Some swore he'd come back. But truth is, it didn't matter. Out here, kindness isn't an investment. It's a kind of wealth you spend without expecting change. And sometimes, the lives we save aren't meant to stay. They're meant to remind us that we were worth saving too.